Well then, I guess I'm going to have to do the weapons now that the armor video did so well. We're doing things slightly different for these since I can't rank them exactly like the armor sets. There are a few new factors to consider this time that I didn't before, so let's get down to how we're rating everything. First and foremost is, of course, the design. We want to make sure our weapons look cool and stylish. Next is the flavor text of the weapon. Generally, the more we get that fleshes out the world and the characters, the better it is. Next is the weapon's damage, which is a bit complicated. We're looking at how good the weapon's attack rating is relative to other options in its category. Is there a particular build that this weapon favors, and how does its attack power and scaling compare to its peers? Speaking of scaling, we're taking prerequisites into account. Will the weapon fit its niche by the time you get it, or are its stats way too high? We're also taking weight into account. Similar to damage, it's going to be relative to its category, otherwise every colossal sword would be a C or worse. Then there's the weapon's location, which generally boils down to how easy and quick you can get the weapon. The last two are somewhat related, the weapon's Ash of War and its moveset. All of these are factored into the weapon's rank. Also, I'm not going to cover all the weapons in one video because that is an absurd thing to do. I'm not going to have something to say for every last weapon either, and for others, I'm not going out of my way for them. Now that that big spiel is out of the way, let's begin. You'd think daggers would be the go-to rogue weapons for their speed and predominantly dexterity-based scaling, but then you realize they have piss-poor range and move on to other weapons with better movesets. Still, there are situations for certain daggers that can overcome this disadvantage, and if you're really committing to the bit, there are still worse weapon categories to pick. The basic dagger, honestly, I don't know what to really say about it because of how utterly basic it is. It drops from a lot of enemies and you'll probably get a dozen of them if you're grinding. Really, it's just here for a measuring stick to compare the other daggers against.
Crazy!
The Urge Steel Dagger is actually rather good for what it is. It's a dagger that has faith scaling, but it can be infused with different Ashes of War. It has a unique R2 that also hits several times, so it's good for stat buildup. Generally, it has good flame art and sacred scaling, but yeah, it's not bad actually.
Brutal!
Whoever uses the crystal knife has a sharp eye for loot because apparently I missed this one on my first playthrough. If somebody actually uses this, chances are they are using it as an offhand with the glintstone Chris because for an int dex weapon, it leaves a lot to be desired. It's stuck with quick step and you can't swap out the Ash of War, so yeah, definitely offhand it.
Crazy!
Bestial Incantation users swear by the Cinquidia for its 10% damage boost to these spells. It also scales more with strength, which is also a crucial stat for the Bestial Seal. Aside from that, it has a very unique design and some good lore associated with it. That said, good luck getting at it because platforming down to it from the Bestial Sanctum is a real trial.
Crazy!
The people who use the Glintstone Chris almost always use the Glintstone Dart skill. But do they know you can charge it? Not sure if the Godfrey icon works on it though. Aside from that, it's a cool looking dagger with some good lore behind it. It's one of the lighter daggers out there too. However, you need to complete Selen's questline, so you're going to have this thing around mid-game. And that's if you know how to complete Selen's questline, or if you've even met her in the first place.
Brutal!
Great knife users are what I call bandit mains. They took this weapon and carried it all the way to the end. To be fair, it's not a bad option in terms of damage. It has very good dex scaling with poison or blood infusions. The only downside is its lack of good flavor text and its admittedly above average design.
Brutal!
The Scorpion Stinger is one of the few weapons in the game that can reliably inflict Scarlet Rot. It's a cool look for the dagger with some nice lore behind the sealed rot god, which kind of justifies why it's in the most hostile location in the game, the Lake of Rot. It also has the repeating thrust skill, which makes status build-up somewhat reliable.
Brutal.
The obligatory weeb joke weapon of the daggers. The few who use it pair it as an offhand for the katana, since it has a special power stance moveset with them. It's debatable if it's genuinely better than using another katana, but those that cite it's better, well, yeah, they're not going to give it up at all.
Brutal.
Another offhand option, the parrying dagger is good for anyone who wants to go with a fencing duelist look, even though using a small shield would give you a better parry. Still, it has good damage scaling with both keen and heavy, so maybe a power stance Raphael build on New Game Plus?
Brutal.
The Blade of Calling is the caster's black knife given its higher faith scaling. You get it by going through a hidden room after taking the lift into the Forbidden Lands, so you're getting it fairly late. I don't know if a lot of people use it, but I generally prefer its successor.
Brutal.
The legendary black knife you get off the assassin outside of the Sainted Hero's grave. It has the same moveset as the Blade of Calling, but the skill is infused with the Destined Death debuff. That cuts off the max health and also does damage over time on an enemy. It stacks with Malekith's Black Blade, so watch out for those builds too. All in all, really, really, really good weapon, and you probably know that because I freaking love the black knives.
Awesome.
Now this is the one for the real edgelords. A bloody blade of bent bones that can send out a blade of blood to inflict bleed. Suffice to say, it's among the most powerful of its category for arcane builds. You can also get it super early from Nigerius, who attacks you near Geel Lake.
Awesome.
Last of the daggers is the Misericord, which is pretty much the crit swap weapon. It has the highest critical rating in the game, bar none. It has a nice thin design to complement its length. Its association with doctors go with various use of it. Strangely, you find it in the Stormvale Castle Armory, which you should absolutely go to, so yeah, it's a given early pickup. I still prefer the rapier as an overall weapon, but still, for anybody who's swapping off for something to crit, that's the go-to.
Brutal.
Chances are, if you use a straight sword, you are a tried and true sword and board nut who plays human fighters in every fantasy game because you're that basic. And really, that's what straight swords generally are. They're mostly easy to wield, they have a solid moveset with some minor tweaks for specific weapons. Yeah, pretty basic. The longsword is the go-to measuring stick for straight swords. It's a solid weapon that is the default for the vagabond, so chances are you picked it and decided it was fine in comparison to the Lord Sword and straight sword, and probably justified it by seeing how it generally handles better with sacred, flame art, and magic infusions.
Brutal.
The Lord Sword and straight sword is the more ornate and marginally better upgrade to the longsword. It has higher base damage for physical infusions. It also has a higher crit rating, so expect that one weirdo to pair it with a dagger talisman, parry you with a buckler, carry in retaliation, or golden parry, and somehow finish you off with a riposte. You also get this off of the faction soldiers, so expect faction soldier cosplays with the sword.
Brutal.
The other alternative to the longsword, the broadsword, is the strength-oriented starting weapon for the Confessor. It's not as ornate as the Lord Swords, but I kinda like the simple yet cool design for it. 9 times out of 10, this is being used on a paladin build.
Brutal.
Does anyone actually use the short sword beyond the starting area when playing Astrologer? Maybe you can get a Goblin Slayer loadout or something, I don't know. It's not that good, but if you use it, okay, I guess? I don't know, maybe you're going for like a twin blade build like freaking Kite from Dot Hack?
Crazy.
The cane sword is a dead giveaway that they're probably going for a Bloodborne build. Chances are they're using it with a whip and swap it out to emulate the effects. You can also expect an offhand crossbow or jar cannon and the traveling perfumer's hat. Or they're buffing it and going for a Jedi cosplay. Aside from that, it's a good keen weapon with some interesting lore behind it.
Brutal.
The Crystal Sword is a really cool looking blade. It has some really good lore expanded upon the Crystallians. But why does it have spinning slash as its weapon art? Why? Why not just have it be like, I don't know, glintstone dart with a crystal projectile or something? Like, spinning slash is okay, but I have no idea why it's on this sword. Also, its a strength int dex scaling is outclassed by the next few weapons.
Brutal.
Speaking of which, the Lazuli Glintstone Sword is a strength-oriented version of the Glintstone Chris, except the weapon part is actually good. In addition to the standard straight sword moveset, its charged heavy is a temporary sword block that can go into an immediate attack. It can be boosted further with the shield talisman as well. It's a good pick for the handful of strength int builds out there.
Awesome.
Quite possibly my favorite straight sword, the Carrier Knight Sword is an ornate, gem-embedded sword wielded by an order of magic knights. Everything surrounding this item is cool, and so is the weapon art that everyone who uses the sword wants to land on you. Some will blindly spam it on you, others will stagger you first and then forego the post for a fully charged Carrion Grandeur, which will hit you for ass damage.
Awesome.
One of the 3 swords associated with Mikola, the Golden Epitaph is a really fancy straight sword you get from the Imp statue room at the start of Assyria Hero's Grave. It's a certified undead killer with its last rites art boosting damage and permanently killing undead. Couple that with its low stat requirements and it's a solid, if situational, sword.
Brutal.
The successor to the Epitaph and the Faith version of the Carrion Knight's Sword, the McKellen Knight's Sword is okay. Its Sacred Blade weapon art is solid for anti-undead fighting. Unfortunately, you get it very late in a bonus area, so it's mainly designed for New Game Plus use, especially with its lackluster scaling. So the people who use the sword are likely on New Game Plus and are Mikella simps.
Brutal.
The Pure Faith Sword is way more viable in PvP than in PvE because it does raw holy damage. That's not super great towards endgame. Its unblockable blade weapon art is cool though, and I'd be willing to bet there are a bunch of Pure Faith casters who love this sword. The paired ornamental straight swords are a multi-hit nightmare. You know what that means. Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, Millennia's Prosthesis, and the Thorny Crystal tier. Since they're gold, you'll likely see them going for a Paladin look too. It's a good set of paired deck swords, and they're worth doing the rematch with Grafted Sign at the 4 Belfries.
Awesome.
The Regalia of Aelcade is the Dex Arc version of another sword we'll get to later. Aside from its cool stained glass mirror design, this sword's weapon art is its big selling point. It's a multi-hit Doril that easily procs multi-hit buffs like I mentioned before, so expect it to be used frequently by anyone who wields it.
Awesome.
The Sword of Saint Trina is the third and final sword associated with Mikola. It's complicated. It's a dex int sword with a massive sleep buildup on it, which can be further boosted by its Ash of War. Chances are they've also got a high crit weapon like the Mr. Cord to switch when they proc sleep. It's got low requirements and can be found relatively early if you know where to look, so yeah, very easy early game pickup that breaks enemies.
Awesome. Awesome!
The Sword of Night and Flame is definitely what I call style over substance. It's a cool looking sword with cool lore behind it and a super awesome weapon skill. However, you need to build around the weapon because of its stats, which are int faith quality, which is really spreading you thin. It's also really out of the way in Caria Manor, so you have to know what you're doing if you want this.
Brutal!
Greatswords are a common staple of JRPGs, and they're not even the biggest category of swords in this game. There are two types of movesets for greatswords, and one of them is objectively better, so those swords generally score higher. That said, it's a decent category to pick. There are a lot of good greatswords, and we'll be talking about them. The Claymore is one of those weapons where you don't really care if it's not the most optimal because of how cool the default skill is. Well, that or you read Claymore back in the day. All in all, it's okay. You get it early in Castle Morn, and it's fine until you get some of the really better ones.
Brutal!
Another early greatsword, the Bastard Sword, is a solid pick for strength builds given its high scaling with the heavy infusion. Otherwise, there's not much else to say about it.
Brutal!
A Soldier of God Rick cosplayer. Otherwise, you're looking at a crit fisher given its above average crit rating. Honestly, the Lord Sworn weapons are pretty mid, all things considered.
Brutal!
The Knight's Greatsword is one of the three weapons with the special two-handed combo, and it boggles me that this isn't the default two-handed moveset for all greatswords. It's so good, it almost outweighs the sword's lack of scaling. The only reason to use this sword is only because you haven't gotten the Banished Knight's Greatsword yet.
Brutal!
Now here is the best quality scaling greatsword of the bunch. Good base damage, good moveset, it even looks cool to boot. It's just a good sword to have in general. Like, if you want just to play a greatsword and have a good time, get the Banished Knight's Greatsword. The only issue is just grinding for it. That's going to be a bit difficult.
Awesome!
The Flamberge is a solid pick for Keen or Bleed infusions given its natural bleed buildup and being one of the few deck scaling greatswords. You get it in Redmane Castle before or after the Radon Festival. Not much of a stereotype beyond the build though. I mean, it's alright, but
Brutal!
A solid strength greatsword for those who can't be bothered to get the Iron Greatsword. See me. That's it, really.
Brutal!
This is basically the Blasphemous Blade before you get the Blasphemous Blade, except it does holy damage instead of fire. Not much else to the Gargoyle Blades. They're okay in design, but they're not very exciting to me as weapons.
Brutal!
The Undead Killer to end all undead killers. The Inseparable Sword not only does more damage to them, but it disintegrates them without the need of a buff. Like the McKellen Knight Sword, it has Secret Blade as well, which is a little disappointing that it doesn't have a unique skill. The other kinda downside is that the earliest you can get it is around mid-game after you complete the Fia and D's quest. That said, it will take you to endgame.
Awesome!
Oh hey, it's the Constipation Consumer Sword. I don't have it, but if you're brave enough to go all the way through the Shining Grounds, it's alright. It's not bad. It has some passive bleed buildup, high base damage, and it has the passive SP on kill buff. The Shriek of Milos is also a really good buff and debuff, and if you're not fond of that, just have it offhanded and power stance it with another greatsword. I'm just not very fond of the Dung Eaters things, you know.
Awesome!
Remember the Regalia of Aelcade? This is the meta version of it. Same loadout, same R2 spam. This time it's strength oriented, and it hurts. To Depending on when you do the shaded castle, it can easily take you from early mid-game to endgame if you're good with it.
Awesome!
Oh hey, another Strength Faith Greatsword, except this time it's Crucible Knight themed. Although it's not nearly as good as Hilarious Tree due to how slow its weapon art is. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad by any means, it's just that there are a lot of better options for this kind of build. You have to fight the Alabaster Lord in the Lake of Rot, which is a task and a half. Not really worth it since there are better strength in greatswords out of there.
Brutal!
2 words. Frostbite Spam. This is by far the lightest greatsword out of the bunch. It favors Dex and Imp with deceptively high int scaling that is not reflected well by the stat block. You can easily find it by beating the Deathrite Bird in Kaled if you're good enough in the early game. It's downright busted for its build.
Awesome!
Another Frostbite sword, but this time it's Strength Int. Helfen Steeple is an incredibly cool looking sword with some amazing pre-Erd Tree lore about death. The weapon's skill gives it frost buildup, which makes it power stance nicely with the Dark Moon Greatsword.
Awesome!
Oh god, I love that fight. Anyways, the Blasphemous Blade is the Strength Faith weapon. No, nix that. It's a quality Strength Faith weapon. That means new game plus, baby. Its design is sick, and the lore describing it is downright brutal. Did I forget to mention the HP restoration? Not only on kill, but also from the weapon art, which means this pairs super well with the Ritual Sword Talisman, which also boosts its damage even further. This sword was forged to kill gods, and it will absolutely get the job done.
Stylish!
Most people complain that the Golden Order Greatsword should be Strength Faith, and considering the other choices on this list, I don't think that's needed. Also, given how this was forged from Radagon's Dark Moon Greatsword, it wouldn't make much sense. My real complaint is that you get it in the farthest corner of the consecrated snowfield from another misbegotten boss. Kinda wish it was in a different place instead of the bonus content corner.
Brutal!
The weapon of choice for all Rani simps. It's a good int weapon and a mainstay of all From Software games, save for Sekiro, I think. Its weapon skill buffs its natural frost buildup and causes its heavy attacks to shoot beams of moonlight. Suffice to say, it's a really cool sword.
Awesome!
The Sacred Relic Sword is one of the 2 weapons you can trade the Elden Beast Remembrance for, and it's a powerful Dex Faith sword that you will use to farm runes off of the Albinurics at Mogwin Palace until you're ready for New Game Plus. Don't get me wrong, it's a great rune clearer, but again, holy weapons suffer in the late game, and by the time you get it, well, you've beaten it.
Awesome!
These are the chunky swords, the biggest swords in Elden Ring, with high weight and slow movesets that had to be patched so that most PvPers would use moves outside of crouch pokes and jump attacks. Most of them require high amounts of strength if you intend to one-hand them. They're intended to be two-handed and even have decent damage reduction when blocking with them. There are far less of them than greatswords, but they cover a good variety of builds. Normally, I'd start with a measuring stick, but in this case, I'm starting with the Zweihander. It's actually more suited for Dex players, and it's probably the lightest of the bunch. You can get it really early from a merchant in the Weeping Peninsula, so it's a really good early game pick if you want a colossal sword that is there, but you can't invest as many points into strength yet for the rest of them.
Brutal!
Alright, jokes aside, this is the Colossal Sword measuring stick. It has good strength scaling and is one of the handful of Colossal Swords that can be infused. The other two, however, don't really square up to the Great Sword, so they're not really worth talking about. Also, you can get the sword super early if you don't mind a death run into Kaled.
Awesome.
Man, this weapon looks cool. Kind of a pity that it's a weapon art isn't all that much to write home about. It's an okay quality int weapon that probably shines more in New Game Plus 2. You can get it fairly early from the Troll Knight enemies at the 4 Belfries and Carrier Manor, so it's got that going for it.
Brutal.
The other Guts cosplayer's sword, the Royal Greatsword, is one of the 2 strength int Colossal Swords, and it's competitive in damage with the Greatsword. Design-wise, it's amazing, and by the time you get it, you've likely gone through a long and emotional journey with Blythe. As you can probably guess, I really like the sword.
Stylish.
The Game of Thrones sword, I mean the Grafted Blade Greatsword, is the other Colossal Sword that you get from the Weeping Peninsula. This one drops from the Leonin Misbegotten at the end of Castle Morn. It's likely going to be the player's first Colossal Sword that they can't wield because you need 27 strength just to two-hand it, never mind one-handed. If you can wield it, it also has a mini Rune of Godric buff, so if you need a short burst of stats for something, this is your go-to weapon.
Awesome.
Another Misbegotten drop, the Ruin's Greatsword, is really cool in its design and moveset. Its heavy attacks send out a wave of gravity spikes, which is neat because I never heard about this part until I actually tested the weapon out. Seriously, why is everyone just spamming its weapon art all the time? Also, despite having int requirements, this is more of a strength weapon, just to let you know.
Brutal.
One of Radahn's remembrance weapons, the Star Scourge Greatswords are paired Colossal Swords that favor strength over int, but unlike the Ruin's Greatsword, they actually scale with both. People who use this sword like to use Starcaller Cry to pull people off of ledges to put in the epic trolling compilation, or they're in full Radahn armor, but that kind of comes with the boss weapon territory.
Awesome.
The Gutslayer's Greatsword is a weird weapon, and the people who tend to use it are weird. It's a Dex Faith weapon that's weaker but faster than the other Colossal Swords. Its weapon art inflicts the Black Flame DOT, but it's hard to land. However, watch out for the follow-up attack. That one will actually get you. Also, it has a very odd design, but you know what? It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool for what it is.
Brutal.
I mentioned before that Malekith's Black Blade gets paired off with the Black Knife due to the max HP reduction stacking. It's definitely more of a PvE weapon because both skills have long windups. In fact, this weapon skill is so good that it basically overcomes the whole damage is less effective because of how good of a boss shredder it is. Generally expect Malekith cosplayers to use this heavily with some bestial incantations. It's a pretty fun weapon if you're just doing PvE. PvP, I can't really say.
Awesome.
That will do it for daggers and general swords. Next time we'll be covering the thrusting swords and curved blades. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and subscribe because I've gotten myself into this mess, and by America, you are joining me on this ride. I'll see you all next time on Design Dungeon.